All right, gang, welcome back to Forestry 470 Wilderness Management. Hope you guys had a really nice Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday and that you had a chance to reflect on the values encoded therein. Welcome back. Does anybody have any announcements for the good of the cause before we jump back in?
Katie and I have some work things coming up at Panther Den Wilderness. They will be on February 22nd and March 22nd. So one's on the day that we're on our trip, but the one in March is not. And they're service learning days at Panther Den Wilderness.
So half the day will be probably building trail, and then the other half is just learning and during an interpretive hike from Steve.
Okay, so for all of my classes, if you go out and do either a trip that is closely thematically appropriate to the class, or especially a service learning opportunity, that can be worth quite a lot of extra credit in my classes, like a full perfect quiz grade on top of all of your perfect quiz grades coming up. And also utterly separate from the extrinsic reward of quiz scores, which don't really matter a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. Nobody remembers what their grades were in 6th grade specifically, right? Just doesn't matter a whole lot. Going out and enjoying a wilderness area and contributing to its well-being in a service learning kind of a way might be a really nice intrinsic reward, and you might learn something about yourself as well as the wilderness area in terms of what you like to do, what values are important to you, and what's worth being an alpha Chad and helping out with United States land management through our National Wilderness Preservation System. Check off Chad Alpha from the list for today. Great. Other announcements, thank you. Cool. Pease and I are set to meet probably later this week to hammer out the last details for summer camp going westward. So just another reminder that our 2026 first info meeting is going to be sometime the first week of February. We'll get the word out through classes and through the forestry listserv. I know nobody uses or checks email anymore, but keep an eye out for stuff like that. And job announcements are still going out over the forestry listserv. So if you're not real sure, check your email every once in a while. Cool. All right. That is announcements. And it's also our wilderness careers and jobs thing. Has anybody seen any wilderness careers or job postings that looked halfway good? Not yet, but soon and for the rest of your life. All right.
I saw a lot on one of the websites I've been looking at.
Okay.
Let me try to figure out what it is. But it has internships, seasonal jobs, all that type of thing. Sorry. If I find it. Oh wait, here. I have too many things on Google. It's called, the website is, it will load. Oh my god, Student Conservation Association.
SCA!
Yes, you can go on and it has just crap tons of different environments, like hundreds. You can put in like keywords, you can put in like wilderness, or I put in like intern or ranger or technician, and they'll have it.
Cool. So, SCA, the Student Conservation Association, has for many years been a primary entry point for folks wanting to get into federal land management, including through things like forestry or forest hydro or especially trail crews and stuff like that. Basically, at the college age range and expertise level, typically it's being a crew leader. So you get some soft skills as well as some hard skill development in terms of things like building wilderness or backcountry trails, campsite maintenance, stuff like that. And it's legit. You are out there doing the thing, not in a classroom reading PowerPoint talking about it. It's getting the work done. So check it out. You're not going to become a multi-billionaire by joining up with SCA, but they are a huge pipeline for, in particular, federal and larger state land management organizations for sure. Okay, so don't want to miss out on those. Student Conservation Association, SCA, totally separate from the people at the library side yard fighting with great swords and foam weapons. That's the Society for Creative Anachronism, totally different. If you're familiar with the lightning bolt, lightning bolt, lightning bolt meme, that's where that came from. Okay, cool. All right, thank you for that. Let's get back into our narrative for the class. The assignment as we were walking out the door on Wednesday of last week was to pull up your laptop or your smart device and take a look at the Wilderness Act of 1964, the original, the OG text that created the need for classes like this one and created the opportunity for millions, hundreds of millions of people to enjoy anything other than a tightly prepackaged, closely groomed, and not very aura-farmed experience at more civilized places like national parks. Check that one off the list. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the Wilderness Act of 1964. This is the only class where I go through the specific language of one piece of legislation. This is the one that sets our entire tempo and our direction and scope for the rest of the semester. So, as boring as it is to read something that Congress crapped out, it's probably pretty important for us to look pretty close at that. So, if you have a smart device, go ahead and pull up the Wilderness Act of 1964. It's 4, 5, 6 pages long as a PDF. Not that big. And let's get into it. Okay, so take a moment to go ahead and pull that up if you have a smart device. And have notes available so that we can slay our way through. Check. Okay, so this is not the Wilderness Act. This is the first section of the introduction to a book called Wilderness and the American Mind by an author named Roderick Nash. A very famous book in forestry circles because it was written 3 years after the Wilderness Act, or its first edition was written 3 years after the Wilderness Act was put together. Wilderness Act 1964, Wilderness and the American Mind, 1967 in its first edition. It's now in its 4th or 5th or 6th edition. This is one of those books that keeps coming up because it really captures, in a human readable way, what the legislation captures in kind of a boring legalese kind of a way. All right, so this is a lot of text. Don't worry, I'll read all this to you for those of you who are auditory learners as well. Wilderness was the basic ingredient of American culture. That's a pretty tall statement. Roderick Nash has a couple of things to say about this and a couple of ways to back it up throughout the book. We won't read the whole book this semester, but we'll take a look at some excerpts of it. From the raw materials of the physical wilderness, Americans built a civilization. With the idea of wilderness, they sought or they tried to or they seeked out to give their civilization identity and meaning. That's a pretty tall statement. The roots of the story lie in the fact that civilization created wilderness. Usually we think about that as the other way around. For nomadic hunters and gatherers, who represented our species for most of its existence, according to paleontologists, modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, are about 380,000 years old as the most recent edition of our species. So nomadic hunters and gatherers, most of the last 380,000 years, and then for about the last 60 years, we have wilderness. So big difference in time scale. For nomadic hunters and gatherers who represented our species for most of its existence, wilderness had no meaning. Everything natural was simply habitat, and people understood themselves to be a part of a seamless, living community with all of the other biotic factors, so wildlife, ecosystems as we understand them now. Lines began to be drawn with the advent of herding, agriculture, and settlement. And here he's using the word lines to talk about boundaries or divisions between what is wild and natural versus what is civilized and not unnatural but developed. So we're discriminating, we are sorting, we are categorizing things as in or out of wild or civilized only very, very, very recently. Okay? So, with this idea in mind, kind of flipping our idea of wilderness being sort of the background of the template, the wild land from which civilization arises, Roderick Nash is kind of pulling out the tablecloth, flipping that on its head, and mogging that idea by saying, no, it's actually civilization that created the concept of wilderness. Check. Okay, enough yapping. So, opening words of the Wilderness Act of 1964. An act to establish a national wilderness preservation system for the permanent good of the whole people and for other purposes. Okay. So, let's get a couple of definitions hammered out here, or at least identified as terms for the purposes of class today. Okay. So, National Wilderness Preservation System. We don't have a definition for this yet. That's what the rest of this document is for in 1964. For the permanent good we're going to need to understand what good really means so that we can do forestry and accomplish this. So we got to define that. The whole people, and for other purposes. We'll get into some of those more specifics a little bit later on. All right? Get ready. More text. Here we go. But in your notes, we want to capture at least these terms showing up on the whiteboard. NWPS, National Wilderness Preservation System. Good. Whole people. And as of this year, we have to re-examine our understanding of what whole people means by Congress in places like parks and wilderness areas. In order to assure that an increasing population, accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization, we'll have to define settlement and mechanization. In order to assure that an increasing population, etc., does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States and its possessions, so things that are actual states, but also things like territories, some of the islands that the United States, the American Empire, has taken over the years. Okay. In order to make sure that that increasing population doesn't leave no lands designated for preservation. That sounds like another keyword. And protection in their natural condition. Man, we can't get through a phrase without getting some new key term we're going to have to be real clear on. Because of all these things, or here's the why, now here's the what. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the Congress to secure for the American people, okay, whole people, American people, of present and future generations, the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. We're 2 sentences in and we've got like we're pushing a dozen definitions now. Okay, it's a pretty thick document. Some might say dummy thick. But that's okay, that's appropriate. We gotta identify all these things. We'll define each of them as we go. And then by the end of this document, we'll be able to take a step back and go, okay, so this is their goal. This one ridiculously long sentence. Did we get there in terms of laying this stuff out in 1964? And then we can also ask the question, as modern foresters in 2026, are we still getting there? Like, is the idea from 1964 still the right idea? And if it is, are we still getting there? Are we still providing that? Are we still managing our forest resources to check all of these boxes? Okay, cool. So this is what's called a preamble. It's kind of the opening statement. It's going to get into some sort of legalese and stuff like that later, but this is setting up the spirit. This is the big vision for where we're going, right? In order to make sure that we don't overpopulate and trample to death everything on Earth, we want to set aside some places as natural for all the benefits that those natural and wild places can give all of us as American people. Cool? So far, so good. Any questions? We roll on. For this purpose, there is hereby established a national wilderness preservation system to be composed of federally owned areas. Okay, so we have this distinction of federal versus not. It's probably a pretty easy definition. Designated by the Congress as wilderness areas. Okay, so this is a very specific term and title. Wilderness area. So this unit of management is exactly on par with a district of a national forest or a unit within a national park. Not the whole national park, but one of its or several of the units of that park, the logical or ecosystem-based divisions administratively inside the outer perimeter of the park, may be set up as wilderness areas. And we'll get into some specifics and criteria and rule this one in and rule that one out and how big does it have to be and who's in charge of it once it's set up as a wilderness area. We'll get into all that stuff. But Congress is making a pretty big move here. This is creating a whole new class of American landmass. We've got private property, state properties like state forests, state parks. We've got local municipal areas like the city of Carbondale is a municipal area. And within the city of Carbondale, we have Carbondale City Parks. So Congress is making a whole new thing. And this is relatively unusual, like not quite 200 years into the life of an empire like America is. To have a whole new designation of land. So this is Congress saying, hey, all that stuff we've been doing for almost the past 200 years, this is like a decade before the bicentennial in 1976, okay? This is Congress saying, okay, we've made some huge changes to how the entire world thinks about forest and other wildland management in the creation of national forests and in particular national parks. It's a distinctly American idea to set aside national parks for everybody's use. Now, almost 50 years, 48 years after the creation of the United States National Park System in 1916, Congress is back again, as the song goes, creating this new thing called wilderness areas. And this is the sentence that does it. It's a big deal. Okay? So, here's the purpose. Here are the things that you and I as wilderness rangers gotta do, or make sure that our efforts are doing as we're managing these wildlands as federally designated, specifically called wilderness areas. These shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such manner as will leave them unimpaired. For future use and enjoyment as wilderness. Okay, so we have wilderness, whatever that is, and we also have wilderness areas where the wilderness happens, is protected and left unimpaired and managed, etc. Okay, so as to provide for the protection of these areas, the preservation, capital P, preservation of their wilderness character. Oh man, another W word. Wilderness character. This is not a character in the sense of a Pokemon or your OC My Little Pony. This is wilderness character as in collection of all of the attributes of this area or place that describe it as something and not something else. Character, the general sense, the sum total of all of its attributes or characteristics. Okay. So, let's back up half a sentence. These shall be administered for the use and enjoyments of the American people in such manner as will leave them unimpaired for future use and enjoyment as wilderness, so as to provide for the protection of these areas. We're going to have to define what that protection looks like. Is this like law enforcement? Is this protecting it from wildland fire or protecting it for wildland fire? Or what do I mean by protection? The preservation of their wilderness character and for the gathering and dissemination of information regarding their use and enjoyment as wilderness. So this place has to be wild and unconfined and free, like the Black Stallion or Misty of Chincoteague. But it's got to be thoroughly surveyed and understood. Okay? This is the part that's going to justify all the tremendous amounts of forestry, ecology, wildlife, and other kinds of science that happen in wilderness areas very intensively, even though the enjoyment of the wilderness means that it has to look like it's not being managed or used very intensively. Okay? It's kind of a paradox there. We got to get a ton of specific information out of these places and analyses that are very sophisticated to understand and organize and use that information in all of the places that are around the wilderness area, because the wilderness is kind of like a wild benchmark of what is most natural, and everything else is less natural around it, so that's kind of our reference point for how degraded some other areas might be. They're more or less like this wilderness sort of highest standard of preservation. So, dissemination of information regarding their use and enjoyment as wilderness. And no federal lands shall be designated as wilderness areas except as provided for in this act or by a subsequent act. So, this is called a carve-out. Congress is carving out for itself the right to make any wildernesses, to set aside some chunk of a national forest, like a district on the Shawnee, for example. Only Congress gets to do that. And that's fine. That's kind of how our separation of powers and checks and balances are in the United States. Congress wants to be able to do that stuff so that they can say, hey, executive branch, hey, President and United States Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, or Department of Interior and Park Service, you guys have to go to your maps and figure out, according to what we say, not what the president says, but what Congress says, looks like we might qualify as a wilderness, and then we'll sign off on it, and then you have to manage that as wilderness. We'll get into some of those details here in a bit. Okay. Any questions so far? This is so exciting, isn't it? Hang in there. Stay with me. The inclusion of an area in the National Wilderness Preservation System notwithstanding, the area shall continue to be managed by the Department, Agriculture or Interior most likely, and the agency, United States Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, those are all the agency levels within their departments. Having jurisdiction thereover immediately before its inclusion in the National Wilderness Preservation System, unless otherwise provided by an act of Congress. So, anybody know how many wilderness areas we have on the Shawnee National Forest?
Or 7 in our area.
Say again?
7 in our area.
7 in our area, 6 on the National Forest, and I believe 1 on the Federal Wildlife Refuge contiguous to it. So I did that. Awesome. Whoever was in charge of it before it was wilderness is still in charge of it now, is all this is saying. This is important because Congress is, and we'll get to this part in a bit, but Congress is about to give the Forest Service and the Park Service a bit of a financial shaft and say, look, you got to do all this stuff and you got to manage these wilderness areas really pretty differently in some ways than you're managing your national park or national forest or wildlife refuge, whatever you're working on right now. We're not going to give you any new money for it. You're not going to get any new personnel for it. You just have to do it. This is called an unfunded mandate, and it's a gamble. It's a gamble that it won't cost a ton more to manage wilderness than what these agencies and organizations already have available to them in terms of not just money, but like expertise and equipment and space and local political context, stuff like that. This is a big deal. So, whoever was in charge of that chunk of forest or park or wildlife refuge or whatever it is, recreation area maybe, that agency is still in charge of it. So, we're going to get this weird sort of hybrid orphan situation going on with the National Wilderness Preservation System. It's a common trick question in exams and quizzes to ask, what is the agency, meaning the one agency that's in charge of running the National Wilderness Preservation System? That's a trick question, because this is saying Forest Service is going to have some newly designated wilderness areas that didn't exist before, and wherever they carve out from the existing national forest to be wilderness, it's still going to be Forest Service in charge of those. But it's going to be Park Service with a different mission, different vocabulary, different skill sets, different human capital size. The park system doesn't have a ton of employees relative to other major land management agencies in the United States, but they still got to manage across agency lines in the same way as Fish and Wildlife and the United States Forest Service. And it's like Hatfields and McCoys at the federal level, right? So Park Service folks think they're, way better and different than Forest Service folks. Forest Service folks are like, yeah, no. And, wilderness was kind of our idea in the first place. And then Fish and Wildlife people are just like, we're just trying to manage wildlife. It's crazy. Okay? So, important detail. Don't get tripped up on a quiz or test when I ask you which agency is in charge of all of the National Wilderness Preservation System places, called wilderness areas. That's a trick question. They're each managed by the own previous agency there. Here's the money bags part. Section 2 Bravo. No appropriation shall be available for payment of expenses or salaries for the administration of the National Wilderness Preservation System. This is like when a professor says, hey, you've all got the syllabus, but then halfway through the semester, hey, we're going to do this extra project or assignment that's like really big, the equivalent of millions of acres, big. But it wasn't in the syllabus. Bye. Can't be as a separate unit, nor shall any or funded as a separate unit, nor shall any appropriations funding be available for additional personnel stated as being required solely for the purpose of managing or administering areas solely because they are included within the National Wilderness Preservation System. So, agencies, rangers, foresters, etc., wildlife habitat managers, technicians, specialists, the whole list of job titles associated with all this stuff. This is just now not just a collateral duty. This is now a sort of main line in the middle of what you need to accomplish all the time with no additional funding or time. Section 2C. A wilderness, in contrast, with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape. It's written in the 1950s and 60s, so right, it's going to be sort of male-focused language, but it's really talking about humankind. A wilderness in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape. Let's add dominate to our list. Dang it, Park, we also got to add landscape. Are you in charge as a wilderness ranger? Are you in charge of anything outside of the border of your administrative unit, the wilderness area? Maybe. The landscape doesn't follow political boundaries. It's topographic. It's what you can see from a spot. And sometimes far beyond that, okay? A wilderness in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape. How much can we dominate the landscape? Like 51%? How do you define the percent? How do you measure that? Is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. We've seen that word untrammeled before. Let's pop it on our list. Where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. This section, now we're starting to get into definitions. What is a wilderness? This is Congress's best attempt to actually line out in plain language, but very specific plain language, non-technical, non-forestry terms, for the most part. What are we even really talking about here? We're like on the second page of the Wilderness Act-ish by this point. So we're getting into some of these details now. Okay? Cool. Just a bunch of smaller text on this one. I got you, fam. I'll read it. Section 2C, continuing definitions. An area of wilderness is further defined to mean in this act an area of undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character and influence. Primeval character and influence. Without permanent improvements or human habitation, people living there day in and day out, week in, week out, year in, year out. Okay. But we do want to define improvements. Which is protected and managed so as to do four things. Preserve its natural conditions, we've seen that language before, and which one? It is defined to one as it generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature. Okay? So this is not a place where the total amount of megawatts or gigawatts of energy, if you break it out into how much of that is sunlight, how much of that is thermal flow through rivers, the total energy budget of a watershed or an area, if at least 51% of that is from natural sources, geothermal springs, geysers, mud pots, solar energy, insolation, like 1,100 watts per square meter here at this latitude. It's a lot of energy across a large area. But humans also generate and transport a lot of energy, mostly in the form of electricity, from one place to another. So this can't be a place where the human energy or material inputs or flows outscore, outrank, outsize the natural cycles. So a surface mine, not going to qualify here. We're moving more tons of ore out than erosion does. Okay? So, generally appears to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature. Whenever you see an adverb, like generally, watch out. Because what does generally mean to you versus what does it mean to me? Do I think 66% and up has to be natural? That's generally, to me, kind of 2/3. What if it's 50.9% of plurality? Does that win for inclusion into the National Wilderness Preservation System? Be careful of adverbs like generally, okay? Affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially, there's another word, substantially, what is that? Like how much is substantially and how much isn't? Okay. 2, has outstanding. Outstanding is another qualitative word, not a quantitative word. Outstanding opportunities for solitude. Solitude is loneliness that you choose on purpose because you don't want to deal with other people's nonsense. Or, it has to have primitive and unconfined types of recreation. So unconfined, fairly clear, no fences, but primitive. We talking Stone Age? We talking 1800s? We talking no technology at all, like not even stone tools? Where's the line on primitive? We'll see some more discussions and arguments about that, for sure. 3, it has at least 5,000, thank goodness, Congress finally let itself get pinned down and gave us like a number, a clear go or no go. If it's not 5,000 acres, which is, how big is 5,000 acres? Do we have any individual farms in the corn and soy desert of the upper 2/3 of Illinois that are more than 5,000 acres? Anybody from up that way? Any big farm? Yeah. 5,000 acres is a number. It's a round number, which means somebody just kind of made it up because they had to draw the line somewhere. And we'll see that Congress in the 1970s starts a conversation of, okay, so what if there's a place of like 4,900 acres? Can we just, like if we squint when we're looking at the sizes, can we just like let a couple other like really choice ones in? We'll wrestle with that. All right. Has at least 5,000 acres of land, or it doesn't have to be 5,000 acres if it is of sufficient size as to make practicable its preservation and use in an unimpaired condition. Oh, we were doing so good. We were legislatively mewing so hard until we had that or, where it's like, totally ignore the clear quantitative cutoff if it's of sufficient size as to make practicable its preservation and use in an unimpaired condition. Man. Unimpaired? Is that? Do we already have unimpaired? Yes, we do. All right. Cool. And 4. First 3 weren't enough. It may also, it does not have to, but it may also, and probably should, also contain ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historic value. So basically, here are 3 relatively clear reasons, and a million billion others from Congress. Okay? Cool. So, this is going to be examined. This paragraph, really this one sentence, is going to get picked apart for at least the next 60 years up until right now. The 50th anniversary, the semi-centennial anniversary of the National Wilderness Preservation System was in 2014, from 1964. And this stuff is still closely scrutinized. There are maybe a few hundred total wilderness preservation study areas, candidates for getting added to the National Wilderness Preservation System. Typically they're smaller and nearby a larger, older wilderness area, but physically disconnected from it by historic logging or an interstate that goes through there. We can't have interstates because it can't have improvements. An improvement is going to be something like a building or a road or an earthwork dam to improve the water supply and regulation for the area downstream or downslope. All right? So, with all of these things, can you think of a place that you've been that is basically or definitely all of these in your own travels, but that is not a wilderness area? At least not a federally designated one. Show of hands. Anybody? Been to a place that's wild, it's untrammeled, people don't live there permanently, it's at least kind of big-ish, 5,000 acres or bigger, or big enough to be managed as a wild, self-contained compartment, so to speak. And it might have ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historic value. Okay? We're not quite there in the history of wilderness areas yet, but soon we're going to be talking about these 5, 6, 7 wilderness areas that are real close to us here in southern Illinois, and how a lot of those are not 5,000 acres or larger. And they've only existed since the 1990s. But they feel pretty wild now. Anybody been hiking or horseback riding or hunting or backpacking through any of these wilderness areas around us? Bald Knob, Clear Springs? Show of hands. Okay. How wild did those spots feel to you close to here? Pretty okay? Okay. Or level greater than 0? Alright. So, maybe spots that aren't quite so big or quite so completely untrammeled and have some historic imprint of man's influence or efforts or development, paving, clear cutting. Used to be a bunch of farms on what is now the Shawnee, right? Now there are wilderness areas with decaying combine harvesters and other farm equipment in like Bald Knob wilderness area over on the west edge of the Shawnee. Pretty wild stuff when you think about what can be included in wilderness given the right justification. All right, then we do have a couple of carve-outs, like prohibitions. It can't be wilderness or can't be included in this new system if it has some of these. If it's got a whole bunch of businesses operating in there, well then that's, even if it's not like megawatts of human energy flowing through, it can't look like a mall. It can't look like an Amazon warehouse. That's not real wild. It can't have permanent roads. But is an old farm road that's not being used anymore, is that still a permanent road? You can see it on the LiDAR, but it may be covered in young, scrubby, trash species, early successional forest. It may not look like a road, but is it still permanent? If it's altered the shape of the planet, you can still see it with LiDAR from space or from a high elevation airplane or whatever. Okay? Except as necessary to meet minimum requirements for the administration of the area. This is a loophole you can drive a forest management truck through. Yeah. So, we'll talk about some of those examples later. Can't have any temporary roads. No use of motor vehicles, motorized equipment, or motorboats. Motorized equipment, do we use any motorized equipment in forest management? Like what? Chainsaws. Chainsaws are so fast. So if I'm a wilderness, like a backcountry, wilderness specific trail trail crew leader, maybe with the SCA. I'm not allowed to bring a chainsaw out there if a 2-person or a 1-person buck saw or a hatchet can get the same job done in like 10 times the time and 100 times the sweat equity. Congress says, yeah, in a real sort of womp womp moment, right? So, motorized equipment. Have you guys ever ridden a bicycle before? Come on, we can't even use bicycles in wilderness? That's not fair. Okay, what about a cell phone? The cell phone or a handheld GPS unit, is that mechanized? No. Oh, there are no moving parts. So we have this weird thing where technologies from between about 1900 and when this was written, 1964, we had bicycles in 1964, a lot of those things are outlawed. But earlier technologies, biotechnology of the modern horse, we've been selectively breeding those for over 10,000 years. They are nothing like their old extinct wild counterparts. The horse is absolutely okay in wilderness, in fact, strongly encouraged. Cell phones, hugely useful in wilderness. But you can't use a chainsaw because that would be too smart. All right, no landing of aircraft. You can fly over most wilderness areas. Congress actually has planes go around certain wilderness areas. Anybody ever see M. Night Shyamalan's The Village?
Yes.
Spoiler alert.
So good.
All right. No other form of mechanical transport. What happens when somebody gets lit, that is, intoxicated by alcohol or other recreational molecules, and drives their old Ford Bronco, where they've taken a Sawzall to most of the roof and turned the Bronco into an SUV pickup and yeeted that thing into the wilderness area and then busted an axle because there's no roads in the wilderness area. And they were more hat than they were cattle in terms of their driving, and now that thing is hopelessly stuck. Like transaxles are shattered. How do you as a wilderness ranger have to get that mechanical thing out after you give the guy a huge ticket and make him pay for the extraction? You literally hitch a team of horses to the chassis and you ride it out like a carriage from 1875. Because we can't use something more mechanical as a solution unless the more mechanical solution is the only solution that will accomplish it. Okay? So we can use helicopters in wilderness. We just can't land the helicopters in wilderness. We can airdrop it in supply. Yeah.
What if, like, is that why they don't fly over it? Like, what if you have an emergency?
Oh, ho! Oh, don't even worry about that. All right, check this. Yes! Congress, in its wisdom, said special provisions. These are going to be exceptions to the very, very, very broad law that they just laid down. Okay? They're going to be spitting bars full of loopholes here. Aircraft or motorboats, fire management, insect management, and disease management. Within wilderness areas designated by this chapter, the use of aircraft or motorboats as mechanized transport, where these uses have already become established. So like in Alaskan wilderness areas, where there are physically no roads anywhere for like 100 miles in any direction, and people have been using little bush planes or float planes to get to one area or another. If they've been doing that prior to 1964, you can still do that in those specific and limited cases. Okay? So, permitted to continue subject to such restrictions as the Secretary of Ag deems desirable. So this isn't carte blanche. You still have to get that exception written down saying, hey, in the wilderness compartments of Denali National Park up in Alaska, you can take a bush plane to these certain spots, and they can land and drop you off and pick you up and do some super duper backcountry hiking or whatever, but it has to be okayed through the Secretary of Ag in this case. All right? And such measures may be taken as may be necessary in the control of fire, insects, and diseases. Where we just can't do safe fire management or effective fire management without having at least a little bit more mechanization. Maybe that might be a case where those chainsaws are pretty important to keep in those wildland fire crews, those hot shots, especially the folks who are going in helicopter mounted and parachuting or rappelling in. They might need some of that mechanization just to survive so that they can do this stuff. All right, great question. Cool, let's end it right there. I'm a little bit over time with that, so we'll pick this up on Monday. Where we are going with this as you're packing up is each of us is going to adopt one or more of these definitions and sort of bird dog down what is the more specific story with each one of these as it's been defined. And then we'll kind of do a lift on putting those all together. See you Monday! No further homework assignment. Just take a look back through the Wilderness Act you've already seen.